Let's review just briefly what we've learned about the faithful and discreet slave just in the last couple of years. So who is the faithful and discreet slave? Well, it's a small group of anointed brothers who are directly involved in preparing and dispensing spiritual food during Christ's presence. And of course, today we know that as the governing body. So who are the domestics? Well, the domestics are all those who are fed spiritually, whether they're the anointed ones or the great crowd of the other sheep. Exciting now that we're included in the domestics, right? When did Jesus appoint the faithful slave over them? Well, he selected the faithful and discreet slave in 1919 and appointed them over the domestics to feed them. Well, when will Christ appoint the faithful slave over all his belongings? Well, that's what our text for today answers for us. If we want to open our Bibles to Matthew 24, and we can read 46 and 47 together. As our commentators pointed out, Jesus made this inspection. It says, "Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly, I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings." So, happy is that slave. Well, we know that now to be the governing body. His master, that's Jesus Christ. Now it says on coming. Of course, our previous translation, you'll notice that our scripture text says on arriving, but that's because we're still back before we had the new translation. But it says on coming. So that was when Jesus came for judgment, or is coming for judgment during the Great Tribulation. It kind of makes sense. First, the appointment was made in 1919 to feed the domestics. Some time goes by. Jesus can see how good they are doing with that job, and when they've done well with that assignment of feeding the domestics, then they get to be over all his belongings when they get their heavenly reward. So that's just a brief overview of some of the things we've learned in the last couple of years. It's been exciting to see and refine our understanding of who the faithful and discreet slave is. But how does a better understanding of who the faithful and discreet slave is really help us individually? Well, I couldn't help but think of Psalm 23 and how well we are taken care of. And I don't know how much of a chance you've had to read Psalm 23 in the New Translation, but there's enough subtle differences to really help the Psalm 23, which was already a beautiful psalm in the Bible. So let's just read it together, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this psalm applies to our understanding of how the faithful and discreet slave and Jehovah and Jesus are taking care of us. It says, "Jehovah is my shepherd, I will lack nothing. In grassy pastures he makes me lie down. He leads me to well-watered resting places. He refreshes me. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for the sake of his name. Though I walk in the valley of deep shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff reassure me. You prepare a table for me before my enemies. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is well filled. Surely goodness and loyal love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of Jehovah for all my days." Now, let's consider three ways that we can feel about the faithful and discreet slave and the arrangement we have today. First of all, is confidence that this arrangement is from Jehovah. It's not of human origin. That having a governing body and the arrangement we have is not something some humans came up with an idea, but it's designed by Jehovah God. If you look in verse 2, it says that he leads me to well-watered places. And also verse 3, he said, he leads me. So we can see that Jehovah is the one that is leading Jehovah's people today, because Jesus even foretold the arrangement that we have today of a faithful and discreet slave that in the time of the end would be leading God's people. It gives us confidence to know that our organization is operating just as Jehovah and Jesus designed and foretold that it would during this time of the end. How about the other idea of protection that is given by a shepherd here in these verses? If we look at verse 4, though I walk in the valley of deep shadow, I fear no harm. So a good shepherd is one that is protecting us and protecting the sheep. Well, how does our understanding of the faithful and discreet slave really protect us today? Well, our previous understanding that all of the anointed around the world were feeding the domestics really could have left us open to some attack by apostates or others who claim to be the anointed and say that they are also feeding the domestics. And this could have led to some confusion in the sheep about who really they should listen to if someone's claiming to be the anointed. But now that door is closed. We know clearly where the direction and spiritual food is coming from, and we don't need to worry that somehow that could be confusing as we get closer to the time of the end. It's really a beautiful protection for us to know clearly where the spiritual food and decision comes from, and that's from the faithful and discreet slave, the governing body. And finally, this chapter 23 is filled with ideas of being well-fed. If we look at verse 1, that we will lack nothing. Verse 2 talks about grassy pastures to make us lie down. Verse 5 is interesting, that you prepare a table for me before my enemies. Well, we certainly have a well-fed spiritual table in front of all our enemies. We're only 8 million with the billions around us, many enemies around us, and yet we're well-fed spiritually. Really, Brother Dunbar's talk last night could not have been a better description of how well-fed spiritually we are and what great care that the faithful and discreet slave is taking to make sure that it's in all languages and all scripts. He did a beautiful job last night of explaining that. And I think all of us came away from that talk really grateful for the work that the faithful and discreet slave is doing with all of these languages and scripts. If you think about it, the faithful and discreet slave has made sure that there isn't any avenue that people can't go to get the truth, whether it's the printed page, audio, video, door-to-door witnessing, personal visits to your home, metropolitan witnessing, or our own TV broadcasting station. I mean, there isn't an avenue that can't be covered for people to find the truth today. And as was mentioned by our commentators today, how pleased Jesus must be to look down and see what a fine job they're doing in feeding the domestics. You know, as you go around the organization and talk with people today and maybe travel a bit, many of the friends will say to you, we feel so close to Jehovah's organization. And isn't it amazing that we're the largest we've ever been, 8 million plus, and yet people feel the closest they ever have to Jehovah's organization. And it's because of the hard work of the faithful and discreet slave in making sure that we have the tools and they feel close to the faithful and discreet slave. So in review, our new understanding of the faithful and discreet slave gives us confidence that this is Jehovah's arrangement. We feel protected and we feel well-fed. And particularly here at Bethel, we have the privilege to not only know these brothers, but to work directly with them here at Bethel. What a privilege that we have.